Okay, well, we're back. Now it's part 3, and we're still talking about child sexual abuse. We talked about appropriate and inappropriate childhood sexual behaviors. We talked about touch, non-touch child sexual abuse. We talked about child sexual abuse as a trauma. And now I'm just going to do a quick reminder that we need to, when we're dealing with children who have been sexually abused, as well as children who have experienced any other form of abuse and neglect, we need to assess for other traumas, other adversities that the children may have experienced. We have to assess for whether or not they got any help for the adversities that they have experienced. We have to assess for what was going right in their lives at the time the abuse and neglect was going on. And when we're dealing with children who have been sexually abused, we have to be very careful about asking them to talk about their abuse and neglect. They have to be able to feel safe when they talk about abuse and neglect. So there's a process of building rapport and building a relationship with the children. And as we've said over and over again, when children have experienced trauma, the best of all possible worlds is for their parents and their siblings to also be involved in the treatment. So we see child sexual abuse as a family issue and not simply an individual issue. And it's a family issue whether or not perpetrators are members of the families. Often perpetrators are friends of the families. Stranger child sexual abuse is relatively rare. We actually don't have accurate statistics on what percentage of perpetrators of child sexual abuse are strangers, but the rate is probably 15%, maybe 10%, could even be less. So almost all people who abuse children sexually are people that the children know. So that automatically becomes a family issue, because if the children know perpetrators, then the families know the perpetrators, and this act of sexual abuse, or the acts of sexual abuse, will affect every member of the family. So every member of the family does need attention, and they all need to be assessed for adversities, secure attachments, other safe havens they might have, such as capacities to talk to other people about personal and sensitive information, and other factors in their lives that were going well. And as we've said many times before, it's really important for kids, for you as professionals, to ensure that everybody who's dealing with trauma knows how to self-regulate, knows how to regulate the emotions that will arise. And it's emotions, but it's also often people's thinking gets all jumbled up. They may start wanting to move. Their heart rate may go up, so there's a physiological self-regulation that needs to be taken into consideration when you're dealing with people who have been sexually abused or who have experienced any other trauma. So one of the things that we've gone over before is when we do the assessments for risks and protective factors, or what is going right in a person's life, we know that we can kind of put people, I don't want to say categories, but there are different levels of intervention needed depending upon the balance of the risks, or the balance of the adversities, or the balance of the traumas, and what's going right, including attachment relationships and opportunities to work through the effects of abuse and neglect. So some children who have experienced child sexual abuse are very low in adversity and very high in safe havens and various ways of dealing with whatever stresses they may have had. So if you have somebody who can be classified as low-high, which means low risk or low adversities or low traumas and high protective factors, they won't need probably as much intervention. They'll still need sensitive, responsive care, but they won't need the same degree of intervention as children who have many risks, many adversities, and very few resources or very few protective factors, or another way to say it is they've had a history of insecure attachments. And especially children who have disorganized attachments, who have experienced child sexual abuse and other traumas, and don't have a lot of safe havens to go to deal with this, they're going to be very difficult to deal with. So it's really important for you as beginning practitioners to know that, because you can burn out pretty quickly if you think that it's going to be easy to help people work through the effects of child sexual abuse and other traumas. It won't be as challenging if the people have many resources and are willing to deal directly with the effects of the abuse and of the child sexual abuse, and if the practitioners are competent, because that's the other factor. Lots of times kids may have relatively high resources and relatively few risks or difficulties, but they don't really get better because of the level of competence of the practitioners. So, but I think you're getting the drift, because we've talked about kids who have high risks and high protective factors, and kids who have low risks and high protective factor, kids and families who have low protective factors and high risks, and then low risks and high protective factors. So depending on the balance of all of these, people will get different treatments. The most common category of people who we deal with in child protection agencies are children and families where there are very, very, very many risks and adversities and relatively few protective factors or resources or secure attachments. The ideal client, so-called ideal client, the one everybody wants, is where they have low risks and high protective factors. But that's relatively uncommon in child protection. Another common type is, as we've gone over before, is people who have high risks and high protective factors. They can be very challenging, but at the same time, there's a lot of hope that if you're competent, that you can mobilize the resources that they have to help them cope with all the risks and adversities. And then there are some people who are low on both, and that's rather unusual. And I said earlier, when it does happen, these people often are followers, and so if they land in a group of kids who are very pro-social and who work hard, all that, they may actually do pretty well and develop some resources themselves. But if they're low and they end up with antisocial kids, they're going to be followers, and they'll do what the other antisocial kids do. So just keep that in mind, that you have to continually look at what are the risks, what are the protective factors, what's the level of intervention, how optimistic can I be about the results, what else do I need to learn in order to be competent. So again and again, we've talked about how important it is when kids have experienced trauma that they have safe havens that are characterized by secure attachments, and they therefore have a place in which to work out the effects, in this case, of child sexual abuse. So I'm just looking through. So I would have shown you this, but it is on the PowerPoint that I placed on Moodle, is that last week we went over the goals of child-parent psychotherapy, and the goals are resilience, which is kids learn to cope with, adapt to, overcome the effects of whatever traumas they've experienced, and resilience can be defined as the development of secure attachments, good executive function, and good self-regulation. Well, that same goal is what we want for children who are survivors of child sexual abuse or any other trauma. So the overall goal is resilience, and you get to resilience through promoting secure attachments and through assessing whether the parents and the children have good executive function and good self-regulation. So the goals of treatment specific to children who have experienced child sexual abuse it's like, what does a securely attached parent, how does a securely attached parent respond to children in the course of everyday life, say infants or young children or older children? A securely attached parent will be sensitively responsive, and the same is true of us as adults when we're dealing with children and families where child sexual abuse has occurred. We have to be sensitively responsive. And of special interest when children have been sexually abused, we have to be sensitively responsive to the effects of the sexual abuse on children's sexuality. And the goal is healthy sexuality. Now, we don't have a ton of time, and we could spend a whole course on this, but healthy sexuality means a lot of different things. And if we were in the same room together, I would ask you, what are the different aspects of healthy sexuality? Because being sexually abused probably affects every aspect of our sexuality. Say if boys have been sexually abused by other boys, for example, or men, they may wonder, they can have questions about their gender identity because they already have this stereotype in their heads that sex only takes place between a male and a female. So if a male sexually abuses them, some kids, especially at a younger age, when they're still thinking concretely, will think, well, maybe I'm not a boy, maybe I'm a girl. So they can be, one of the effects of child sexual abuse can be gender identity confusion. Now, that's not the same thing as kids who are transgender. Kids who are transgender are born transgender, but kids who develop gender identity confusion didn't have really any questions about what gender they were, but because they were sexually abused by somebody of the same gender, because it can happen to girls too at a young age, that they might think, well, maybe I'm a boy because, a female sexually abused me and it's only supposed to take place between males and females, so I must be a male. So we have to be open to that kids who've been sexually abused, especially at a young age, may have issues and traumas related to their gender identity. Sometimes kids will also have issues related to their sexual identity because it's very common when children, young children included, are sexually abused, that they experience sexual arousal. And sexual arousal, whether we like it or not, does feel good. Now that's not the only experience the young children are having, or even older kids are having, that may be sexual pleasure, but there's also dread and fear and what's going on and I'm not in control and people are assaulting my sense of autonomy, my freedom of choice. So there's all kinds of things mixed in. But one of the things that can happen is that people can say, well, gee, a boy sexually abused me or a man sexually abused me and I'm a boy, and so when I was sexually aroused, does that mean I'm gay or not? And the same thing can happen to girls. Girls can wonder if they're lesbians if they were sexually aroused by a sexually abusive female. So we have to be prepared for that. We have to be prepared for gender identity trauma. We have to be related to sexual identity trauma. We have to understand how confusing and difficult this is for kids. We have to be able to tolerate the idea that kids can be sexually aroused by sexual abuse. Now, not all kids are, so you can't assume it, but you have to be open to the idea that that could be part of the children's experience. This can be very difficult for adults, and dealing with children and families where child sexual abuse has occurred requires a great deal of preparation, requires a great capacity to handle your own emotions and to be comfortable with all your sexual identities as well. Because if you have questions about your sexual identity and then you're talking to a 9-year-old who has questions about her sexual identity, you might not be able to be psychologically present because you're often the wild blue yonder, spinning or dysregulating about your own issues related to sexuality. So those are some of the sexual traumas that children can experience. Now, some children who have been sexually abused, especially if they don't get help with it, will also have issues related to, some will have issues related to being afraid of sexuality because it's a trauma, and as you know, when people are traumatized, they may avoid what made them so traumatized, and so people can experience avoidance of sexual interactions. And as with other kinds of trauma, when people are traumatized, they may feel a compulsion to repeat what happened to them, and We don't know for sure why people repeat traumatic experiences, but we think it's because they think, well, if I do it this time, maybe it will turn out differently. But because the inner working models or the brain circuits have already developed, it's very unlikely that if they continue to seek sexual relationships, that things are going to be any different, because how they're perceiving the situation will affect how they experience the situation, and how they perceive the present situation is related to how they experienced relationships and the sexual relationships in the past. So the overall point is that, and this is a really quick overview, believe me, that when we're dealing with people who've been sexually abused, we have to be prepared for a whole range of sexualized trauma. And it's related to every aspect of what it means to be sexually healthy. Now, a sexually healthy person would have secure relationships and therefore have very functional inner working models. So they would be unlikely, unless they chose to have sex with a whole bunch of different people. Typically, they would want to have sex with people they like and trust, and they would have good intuition about who to trust and who not to trust, and they would know how to test trust, just the way Lily in The Secret Life of Bees tests August a long time before she trusts her. That's a very healthy thing. You don't automatically trust people, just think they're cute just because you want to jump in bed with them. You want to wait and see, who are they? An inner working model may be triggered, and I imagine this person to be Mr. Wonderful or Miss Wonderful, and actually all they want is to use you sexually. So you don't know that necessarily at the beginning. So the long and the short of it is that kids who've been sexually abused may have sexual trauma of various sorts. If they have sexual trauma, they need the safety of secure relationships. Often parents aren't equipped to deal with all the various sexual traumas that children experience. So families need specialized treatment in order to deal with the effects of sexual abuse. So let me see what's next here on my. So the goals of child-parent psychotherapy, besides what we've just talked about, is we want to repair the attachment relationships. We want realistic inner working models. We want capacities for self-regulation. If somebody's acting out sexually, or if somebody is avoiding sexuality, those are both issues with self-regulation. I see tremendous issues with self-regulation with men who sexually abuse children, because they often use the sexual activity as a way of making themselves feel better. If they're using this sexual activity with the children to make themselves feel better, to get a high, or to get a buzz, or to feel better because they can control somebody else, those are all efforts to self-regulate. And that's very hurtful. It's hurtful to them, but of course they don't see that. And it's hurtful to the children as well, and they often don't see that either. So working with perpetrators of child sexual abuse requires a tremendous amount of skill in terms of exploring their attachment relationships, exploring their inner working models, exploring their usual ways of self-regulating or making themselves feel better, helping themselves calm down. You have to have them think about self-regulation, executive function as well, because they're not thinking about consequences for the children, they're not thinking about consequences for themselves or for anybody else. All they're thinking about is, I want to feel better, I want to do this, and they have tunnel vision. So all of the things we've learned about in the needs applies very well in child sexual abuse. It applies to perpetrators, it applies to the children, it often applies to the parents, because the parents can become extremely dysregulated when they learn that their children have been sexually abused. Now, of course, some degree of dysregulation is expected. What would you do if you learned one of your children or several of your children have been sexually abused? You'd be shocked, you'd be angry, you'd be guilty, you'd blame yourself, you'd think, oh, what did I do wrong? It's very natural for parents to go through even sometimes a prolonged period of dysregulation. But if they have secure attachments also as part of their inner working models, eventually they'll realize that they really need to re-regulate so they can think clearly about how to respond and how they can be helpful to their children. So I hope you're seeing how what we've learned in the first part of the semester is applying to child sexual abuse. Fortunately, we'll have time in 2 weeks to talk in more detail about this. One of the other characteristics of people who are healthy sexually and healthy in other ways, besides having realistic inner working models, capacities for self-regulation, good executive function, but they're also very well attuned to themselves, what's going on inside of them, and very well attuned to others. And I know that survivors who have had other risks or other traumas often are preoccupied, and so if you're preoccupied, you're not going to be very well attuned to other people, and often, even though you're preoccupied, you're not really able to name all the different feelings that you're feeling. You're just feeling a lot of turmoil. And this is also true of perpetrators of child sexual abuse. They are very misattuned. They often have very little understanding of what's going on inside of them, except they feel crappy, or they feel numb, or they feel bored. They'll have feelings like that, but they won't be able to go into any kind of detail. And so they tend to be preoccupied too, even though they may not realize that they're preoccupied. And they're certainly not attuned to others. And so it's fantastic how the 5 topics that we've covered, neurobiology, executive function, attachment, trauma, and self-regulation, help us understand child sexual abuse. So I think I'll stop now, and the next video will be on talking to children who have been sexually abused. So stay tuned.